oh, well, if I say I'm doubting it, does that mean something's wrong with me? Does that mean like, are people going to assume that like maybe I'm not really going to be a great mom?
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. My name is Reesa and I'm your host. We are talking to real families about real stories here on The Real Family Eats, where we've got food for thought and thoughtful food. So let's eat. Hey everyone. So joining us today is the lovely Rachel. Hi Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
So for anybody who doesn't know you, can you introduce yourself for us?
Yes, so my name is Rachel Sorensen. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I co-own a practice in the western suburbs of Chicago. So I'm probably like half hour from the city. So I see people in office. I also see people in Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa virtually. I'm licensed in all three states, and I primarily work with people really of any age, starting at like age 5 or 6 with really high anxiety or OCD symptoms. That's really my niche. But then I've been working with kids and teens and young adults on a variety of things also for the last, 5, 6 years. So that's really like my really exciting, like I love working with those types of clients. And then I also do a lot of parent strategy, working with parents on creating plans to, parent with intention, really trying to get parents on the same page with what their family goals are. So things that are really valuable conversations, but sometimes,
Mhm.
with just how busy life is, the conversations don't always happen as often, or, they don't always have a game plan, in place,
Yeah,
especially with how fast kids grow and different ages and different needs. So I do that a lot too, and I really enjoy that work also. So that's a little bit about me.
wonderful. Awesome. And a parent yourself, correct?
I am a parent myself, yes. So my daughter is about to be 8 months old, so a new parent. So I can definitely relate to um, everything I've ever talked about with any of my clients. I have like the real view at this point, which is great.
Right? It's a
Yeah.
very, when you're in it right now.
Definitely. I think this is, I mean, from what everyone says too, like this is certainly the you're the most in it, really consumed. Like they need you so much and you are
Mhm.
so aware of how much they need you. So a lot of your other priorities and needs sometimes take a back seat. You really have to try to make sure you're getting some sort of semblance of balance because it is hard to do that if you're not aware of it.
Absolutely. And that's the theme, right? And this is hard.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I was so excited when you talked to me about like what this podcast was going to be and what it was
Mhm.
going to be about because I think that there's even with there's so much content obviously online about like parenting and how you can parent and here are the ways to improve things like all the
Yeah.
time and obvious and even right what I just talked about like having goals with parents like all of that is super great and positive and it's great that people want to work toward that. But I also think there's
Mhm.
this mentality that like if you as a parent do something perfectly, then everything goes as it should. And if it's
Yeah.
not going as it should, then that's because you're not doing some sort of formula the accurate way. Um,
Mhm.
and so it just treats kids like well, really families like their formulas, and that if everything was just A plus B, it would all work out. And I just don't, I think that's so unrealistic, but I think that's what you get fed online all the time, even from, in well-meaning ways, but that's just what you see. So I think that this concept of really talking about some topics that people just don't discuss the real struggle, or they might talk about they might say it's a struggle, but you don't really understand how or why. I think this will shed a
Mhm.
lot of light on a lot of topics. I think it'll help so many people.
That's the hope. Because you're absolutely right. There is, again, for many, it is well intentioned, but not necessarily um, really kind of taking a look at what are the issues that parents are truly struggling with in real time, and normalizing that struggle, because it is really difficult and there isn't, you talk about putting together a plan. Those are things that you have to kind of develop. You don't give birth or adopt or any of those things, get given a child essentially and a manual to go with it, like any of your other um, you know maybe appliances that you get. And like you said, if you don't have that exact formula, it can be really easy to slip into that mindset that it's somehow related to you not studying hard enough, or not being knowledgeable enough, and a failing on your part, which is just a really difficult narrative to kind of get unstuck from.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm so excited to chat a little bit more about your story. And, but first, I would love to kind of, for anybody who's in that area who might be needing of your services, where can they find you? This is our shameless plug. Put it out there so that people can get your services.
Yes, so they can find me at www.sorensenandfamilyservices.com. So that's my website for
Okay.
my practice. Sorensen is spelled with E-N, not O-N, just
Okay.
just to clarify. You can also find me on Psychology Today if you want to read my profile. If you search Rachel Sorensen, and you can see the different therapy modalities I use. You can see information about some of my previous experience, things like that. So those are the best
Perfect.
places to find me.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure all of that gets linked in our show notes as well. So if you didn't catch it, make sure to just click on down and you'll be able to see it there as well. So, what is this recipe that you're going to be teaching me today?
Okay, so I cannot remember where I originally found this recipe. Like it's something that
Okay.
I've just made for so long, but I thought about it because I started making it when I was living in California, getting my master's in the program with you at
Mm-hmm.
University of San Diego. And so it was something I made all the time because it like I was living by myself. It had like protein. It was, like gave me a lot of energy, but it was really comforting and you can
Okay.
really customize it a lot. So like if you had leftovers, things, it was just always easy to make. So it's a egg over cheesy polenta with veggies and pesto.
Okay.
Hmm.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so excited. I have not actually ever. I like to cook a lot. I feel like that's a known thing. That's over here. But I have not ever actually cooked polenta, so I'm excited. Or I don't know if I've even tasted polenta, which is really strange for me. So I'm
Cool. And you know
excited.
what? By itself, kind of bland, but it's like because it's bland, you can do anything you want, So
Yeah.
it's like any seasoning, any topping. So it's very versatile. It's very satisfying.
Very cool. Okay, so can you get me started with some of the steps that I'll be doing here, and then I'll get things going here while you and I chit chat.
Yeah, that sounds great. So to
Okay.
start, so you want to get your egg prepared first, or get all
Okay.
the things you need ready for the egg, and then typically I make it just over easy. But if people also wanted to poach their egg, or if they wanted to um, do it like over hard or whatever, you could do it lots of different
Mhm.
ways. But so you'll
Okay.
just fry the egg as per normal, and then the polenta, you can just follow the instructions on the box. So I don't know if you did the instant or the longer one, but really you're just boiling water and then mixing in the corn grits, and then you're letting that kind of simmer until it soaks in like rice. And then the veggies on the side, you can season. And I like this too because if you have like anything in your fridge from like the week before, you can just kind of use whatever you have, season it with
Yeah.
salt, pepper, whatever you want. And then at the end, we'll combine everything and put some pesto on top.
Wonderful. I can do that. All right. So while I get things going, I know one of the things that we were going to chat about today is you maybe had not necessarily the jumping to it kind of, I've always dreamed of being a parent, kind of, yeah, I'm in it, I've done the steps, I'm ready to go kind of experience. And which is not necessarily the traditional, in the kind of, again, beaver cleaver kind of way, that it's just kind of expected. Um you have a uterus and so you're going to have a baby kind of deal. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey and kind of your walkthrough in that regards.
Yeah. So yeah, when you had reached out and we were, talking about topics, it occurred to me that like there's definitely so many topics about parenting, like you talked about earlier, that are really important to discuss. But something that I had kind of gone through that before I had gone through it had really not heard anyone speak of it. And then afterward, now I hear about it all the time. Like now that I talk about it, I hear other people talking about it, which is interesting.
That
Um,
is interesting.
so it is this idea of like really whether or not to have children in general. So
Okay.
to your point, or to what you referenced, so when I was like, in my early 20s, I think I was like, yeah, maybe I'll have kids, maybe I won't. I don't think I ever had this sense of I know there are some people that feel like they are really destined to be parents, like it is what
Hmm.
they have thought about, wanted, from a very young age or younger age, or it's something they've always kind of inherently known. And I never had this like strong feeling that I would never have kids. I did at a point think like maybe I won't really have any. I don't know if I want any in general. But that was like my early 20s. It was not really my focus. I hadn't found a partner. So it was kind of this vague, like someday I'll kind of think about it. It wasn't like
Yeah.
really that important feeling at the time.
Hmm.
Trying to
Not top
establish,
of mind.
yeah, not top of mind, establishing my career. I was in school, dating. It just wasn't like, oh, this needs to be decided upon tomorrow.
Hmm.
So I was kind of neutral or ambivalent about it. And then I met my now husband. And then as when we met and we were talking about like our future, I could definitely see it. I felt like, okay, like I would want to have children with him, like that. I see
Mm.
our family picture in my mind. Like this feels like this would really be something like I want. But again, it kind of felt like, oh, in the future, like when we're a little older, like when we've been married for a few years, like we'll kind of talk about it, figure it out. So it still
Mm.
didn't feel like this immediate decision, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, and then we got married in the fall, right before the pandemic. So we just slipped right on in there. And when the pandemic hit, it's kind of our conversations about it accelerated a little. Like, what timeline do we want? Maybe we don't want children right now because we might not be able to be in the hospital together. Like, so there was kind of this, I guess, more detailed discussion about timeline. Um, and then once
And
things
was
kind of
that,
settled, oh, go ahead.
oh, I apologize. I was going to ask, like, is that a conversation that you were having ahead of time in that detail? Because I know you talked, especially the work that you do, that sometimes having those conversations that maybe you just haven't had yet, and now kind of kids are already in the picture. We're having to have some of these conversations, and I feel like that's always a toss up that I hear with parents. Some they're like, "Oh, this is conversations that we've had before we got married or before we decided to really kind of commit to one another." And there are some that like, no, we didn't really have these conversations until much later in our relationship.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did talk about it before getting engaged, before getting married. And we both
Okay.
were on the page of like, yep, we want children someday. What we didn't
Gotcha.
really talk about in part of those conversations was really the timeline.
Okay.
Like, I don't think we really had a detailed conversation about that prior. And then once we were married, like even a couple of months after we were married, before the pandemic had hit, we had a couple conversations about it because my husband was ready actually right then. It was like ready pretty much upon marriage. He was like, okay, great, we got married. Now we can move on to the next goal.
Check.
And
Next one.
yeah, and I was the one who said and had the feeling like, wait, like we haven't really had like any newlywed time together, just the two of us. Like I want to have that, like that feels important. And then we definitely got that time with the pandemic, like living together and being together all the time, which was really nice in terms of that goal. Um, but I think that's when I really had to start looking at my own kind of thought process on it because then the pandemic kind of simmered down. We were
Mm-hmm.
vaccinated. And so a lot, and then, right, we'd had all this time together. So a lot of the things that I thought were like, oh, okay, this is what I need. And this is kind of what I'm waiting for to feel comfortable. We would then have the conversation again, and I would just feel a lot of fear. I would get this feeling of like dread, and I didn't really understand it. Like, I did not really know, like, right, I like in my mind, I thought I've made this decision. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why now I still have these like physical reactions to it or why I feel so concerned about it. Um, and in the back of not back of my mind, but I guess the things that I was thinking were also referencing what you mentioned, like, am I just doing this because this is like the expected next step? Like, is this actually what I really want to do? Like, have I only been picturing this because this is what I'm kind of told that I should be doing next, not by my
Yeah.
husband, but like societally, that's like your natural progression.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
Is that is that kind of where, because I heard you mention the words kind of fear and dread, and those are big words. They're not just words for us to kind of gloss over. So I'm super curious, like for you, I know maybe not in the moment, but maybe if you were kind of looking back, are you able to maybe um, have some insight now or awareness, kind of what was the function of that fear and that dread, or where was it coming from for you?
yeah, I think so. In retrospect, I think the feeling came from like you don't have a lot of control of like what child you have, if your body's physically healthy during a pregnancy,
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to even be able to get pregnant easily, like all of those things are things that like you don't really think about until it's time, right? To like actually start trying to have a child. And so I think some of the fear was like I'm not going to have a lot of control or a lot of certainty about what's going to happen to like me. Will my child be healthy? Like I think I had some
Okay.
fears too of that, which I
Mm-hmm.
think all are normal. I think most people think about those things.
Yeah.
But again, maybe don't necessarily talk about how you think about that like as you're trying to get pregnant. You're like just hopeful that everything goes well, and a lot of people everything does go well, but a lot of people you hear a lot of stories where things don't go well. And so or there are complications or things that were unexpected. So I think some of my fear was that.
Okay.
And then I think my other fear that I had kind of determined, which is what led me to actually deciding to have a child, is that I felt like I just didn't know how I was going to be able to manage everything. Like I felt a really big sense of responsibility that, once you have a child, like they really are your priority in a good way. But if
Okay.
they're my priority and I'm paying attention to them and I'm really trying to attend to all of their needs, how am I going to like do anything else? Like how am I going to juggle the career? How am I going to juggle the
Mm.
household things we need to do? How am I going to make sure my husband and I still have time for each other? So it felt more like almost logistical worries that were kind of holding me
Okay.
back. Um, and so then that's what ultimately led to my decision to have a child because those are all like solvable problems, right? Like those actually have more to do with like how am I going to balance everything else because I want to pay attention to this child and I want to spend time with this child.
Okay.
Not like, oh, like they're going to get in the way of all of these things that I want to do. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yeah. So it was something, it sounds like that you were kind of excited for. And so therefore there was, more motivation to kind of maybe do a little bit more of that problem solving and saying, this is something that maybe I am interested in making time for, and spending that focus on, and being able to kind of say maybe it can be an and versus an or, it sounds like.
Ex exactly. Hit the nail on the head. Because I think,
Yeah.
and maybe it's because of having, I mean, again, I think there is this societal pressure. I
Oh,
think it's changing a little, but I do think there's this societal pressure or narrative that like, okay, you go to school. Then after you go to school, you find someone and you date and you get married, or you at least find like a long time term partner. Then you have
Okay.
children, and like those are your steps.
Mm.
And so I also was just, I think, fearful of making a decision that was just because of that and not more from an intentional place.
Why was that something that was so present as far as I don't want to make this decision because society tells me that's the decision I'm supposed to make? Because it sounds like you were kind of really like fighting against that and like, no, you're not going to tell me kind of what I'm going to do with my life.
Yes, and I will say that is a personality trait of mine. I will say I'm not shocked. It's funny actually hear you say that because yeah, that like adds up. Yeah, I think that well, why I didn't want that is because I think that if you decide to have a child, you are deciding to take on whatever that means, right? Like you don't know what kind
Mm.
of personality your child's going to have. You don't
Mm-hmm.
know if they'll be like you. You don't know if they'll be like your partner. You don't know if they'll be completely their own individual. Like you have no idea, right? And so
Yeah.
your job, or in my perspective, is that your job is to guide, teach, like expose them to things in the world, and really you're
Mm.
just kind of trying your best. You're trying to teach them these lessons and you hope that they take them and that they run with them, right? But you don't really have a lot of control over that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there are people that go into parenthood because it's their next natural step. Um,
Okay.
and like or and even and not even just parenthood, like they get married because it's the next natural step and this is just the timeline, or right, this is the timeline for kids and other people are having kids that they know, and so then you just have kids because the other people that you know of your age are having children, and
Mm.
I don't think that that's like so conscious. I don't think people are just deciding like, oh, I'm just going to do this with no thought. um,
Yeah.
but I do think there is like this keeping up with the Joneses mentality sometimes, and that's just what you're supposed to do. And then, I just don't, I feel like you'd be happier, or I know I was going to be happier if I knew all the reasons I wanted to be a parent. That way, like, no matter what kind of child I had, no matter what ended up happening, I was coming from like my values based on it. It wasn't just, oh, I know other people right now that are having kids, and so I'm gonna, start now. Um, so that's why it was really important to me. And I also think then like parenting's hard. So I think it's really easy to have a lot more resentment of like a child or the things you have to do if you weren't really like fully committed at the start.
Yeah. I imagine so, like you said, because sometimes it does require some sort of sacrifice, whether it's sleep or whether it's time, money, whatever that is. There's some sort of um, giving that we're doing to a being that's really only doing a lot of giving, not a whole, or a lot of taking, not a whole lot of giving themselves, rather. And so, there are really hard decisions, like you said, to be made. And so, there, in, I feel like for most people, in order to kind of really have that buy in themselves, there needs to be some sort of like internal motivation of like, okay, I understand maybe why I did this, or, this decision that was made, um, to kind of continue and bringing them into the world. That's a lot to ask of a person. And so I can absolutely appreciate why, that's not really fair to ask of someone who wasn't willing, or, kind of had that buy-in.
Yeah, exactly. So I will say something that was super helpful. So, I mean, I feel like, so I had all these thoughts, I had all these feelings, and I was like, I don't, and my husband, I love him. He was so supportive. He was obviously like a biased party because he's like, well, I want them, and like,
Yeah.
I'm willing on, to wait for your timeline. If you give me like an actual timeline, or if that's not in the cards for us, like I just want to know so then we can have like a different outlook of what we're going to do. But,
Okay.
like but having kind of like this vague idea is not like putting us on a page where we're having the same goals, right? Which is so valid. Um,
Hmm.
so I was like, okay, right. Like I just keep spinning on this and spinning on this decision. I don't know. So I, Googled because what's what we all do. So I was like, what do you do when you don't know if you want kids? And there was like all these different articles and posts and whatever. But I came across this book that I wish I could put a banner with this book like everywhere that everyone could see. It's called The Baby Decision. Um,
Okay.
by
Do you know who it's by?
Merle Bombardieri. So
Okay.
she's a therapist, and the book actually came out, the first version of the book came out in the very early 80s. So it's been around a long
Oh,
time. Yeah.
interesting. And
So
I
interesting.
haven't heard of that one.
I had never heard of it. And I like read the description of it, and it was basically like literally speaking to exactly what I was struggling with. Like
Okay.
if you think you want children but don't know when, if you don't know if you want to have children yourself or adopt, or like here are all of the scenarios, read this book, there are exercises, see what kind of comes of it. And so it was
Okay.
great. Every chapter had information, it had exercises in every chapter. You could do it with yourself or a partner. Um, like both individually, both together, or just yourself. And it
Okay.
was great. It led to like so much clarity about like I do want children. I do have that as a value. It's just this feeling of like I was mentioning earlier, like I don't know how I'm gonna balance everything. I feel
Hmm.
like I'm so responsible for this child. It's so important to me that my child is growing in a happy, healthy environment, that I'm worried that like all these other demands I have are going to take away from that.
Hmm.
Um, and so it just led to like definitely an aha moment where I was like, okay, like I really do want this. It's that I just don't know what this is all going to look like. That feels very scary.
Yeah.
Um, but really like if that wasn't a component, then this wouldn't even be like a difficult choice.
So it sounds like for you, it was very much some of that unknown kind of playing into it, which I think is so super duper valid because how many times a day do we as human beings kind of stray away from something because it's unknown? And so even though we're, maybe deeply unhappy or unsatisfied, we go, well, at least I know this. I know what the end of the day is going to look like in this unhappiness, if you will. Um, but choosing something different or choosing to pursue your happiness is scary because you don't know what the other side is going to look like.
Yeah. Like you said, it's like even if it's uncomfortable, or like even if it's uncomfortable what you're doing, you still have the comfort of like knowing what to expect,
Yeah.
right? So it is kind of like how do you push yourself to do something that you know you want and you're just not going to know the outcome. And I think that's hard
Mm.
for a lot of people, in a lot to your point, like in your career, in like where you decide to move, where you go to school, like all those decisions. I feel like it's really similar. You could apply that to a lot of things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So that was really helpful. And I will say I still think about like that book or the decision, like even after making it, because they're like you met like we talked about parenting is hard, like especially right now. I'm in the trenches. I'm certainly not sleeping right now. We're like in a little bit of a spurt of something or other, whatever. You could look online and there's like 3,000 reasons, right? Every day.
But
Um,
even that, like, who knows what your actual child is, right?
Yeah, you know
It's going
nothing. You
on
have
for them.
absolutely, you know nothing. I have no information, don't know why it's happening, whatever. Um, but I like at the end of the day, or like in some of those tough moments, I always come back to like, okay, I know this is really hard, but like this, I guess I have comfort in like this is still like the decision I wanted. Like this is just a
Mm.
tough moment, but like this is something that is really important to me. Like caring for her is really important to me, even if this is a really tough like day or week or whatever. So I feel like it does provide me with this anchor of certainty, at least in like what I am doing and why. That's like
Okay.
not dependent on how she's doing. Because obviously, I mean, they're growing so fast and they change so much. Like every day is so variable that
Yeah.
like to depend it on to if you depended everything on that, like there you would not you couldn't handle it. That'd be like so challenging.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I think that's really valuable to, you mentioned a couple times here kind of that value driven, way of thinking, when reflecting on these really tough times as a parent. Like, can you say more about that and more about why for you, you found that it's been maybe more helpful in overcoming some of those times versus, like you said, if it's purely just for them driven, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. So like my like even before having her, family is really important to me. Like having a strong family unit, having a family that like shows care and love for one another and is kind to one another, like that's so important to me. And
Mm-hmm.
then in having, in deciding to have a child, I wanted to have a child to add a member to our family, right? Not with the expectation of like they're going to follow this little formula and like everything they do is going to be so easy and smooth and perfect all the time. Like you logically know that that's not the case. But since I had made this decision based on knowing I wanted to like guide a child and support them and show them a lot of love and care, and like that's my ultimate goal,
Mm-hmm.
that when these tough moments happen, I'm not I guess I'm not expecting her to like act in a certain way in order for like myself to feel satisfied, right? Like I'm not thinking, okay, well, I'll only feel better if she, does X, or like everything will be peaceful if she just did Y, because that's just not
Okay.
true. That's just not true because you just can't expect that of, especially for her age, but you can't expect that really of like any child of any age. Um,
Well, I think that could be said for any human, right? Like if you're saying I can only succeed, I can only move forward if this other person just kind of gets their act together, if you will, you're going to be waiting around a really long time because humans are, I say it all the time, humans are fickle creatures.
yes. So,
You can't
so I
depend on
think
that.
I think that's how it helps me because in times where like for example, these last 3 nights, she has gone to bed and she's been waking up at like 10 o'clock for, I don't know, no reason. I don't know. She's just waking up. She won't really go back to sleep unless you pick her up and rock her for like 10 minutes and then she'll go back to bed. But if you leave her, she's just like protests. She's just like uncomfortable. I don't know why. Maybe it's teeth.
Mm,
Maybe she has a cold coming. Like it could be 1,000 things, right?
yeah.
And so that's tough. Like mentally, that's tough. You're like you already have put her to sleep. You're thinking you have some independent like alone time. You're getting ready, and she like knows my head like hits the pillow, and then she starts crying. Like they like have a sixth sense. Um,
100%.
yeah, and so because I know, like in those moments, I'm like, oh, like okay, deep breath. I like she's going through something. Like I don't know what she's going through. She's having a hard time and I wanted to have a child to like help them and show them love, right? And like I really this is why I did this. And so
Okay.
you have to do that in moments that are hard, not just moments that are easy. It's like easy to
Mm,
like give love to a child when they're like laughing and like playing with you and talking to you. She's not there yet, but like when all that happens and they're like giving you hugs and they're like telling you they love you, yes, you can like love a child very easily in those moments. It's harder to stay calm and remember that that's like who you're dealing with when they're having a hard time. Like they are struggling, they're crying, they're upset. And it's not that you don't love them in those moments, but it's just hard to put aside sometimes like the immediate frustration
yeah.
with your kind of long-term value. And so that's where it's helped me because there's never been a question now ever since I made that decision of like, why am I doing this? Or like, oh, like this is so annoying. Like I should, like maybe I made the wrong decision. Like I never have those doubts, which I think even having those kinds of thoughts is normal. I'm not saying it's not, but I just feel like I have a more centered view of it, which I think for me it makes things easier when it's already tough.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to kind of circle back to kind of before you did make that decision to move forward and kind of expanding your family. And, I'm really curious, did you, when you were vacillating and going, I don't know if this is really my value, and something that I want to do, is it just because I'm feeling maybe that external pressure? Were there particular ways for you in your kind of journey that you were feeling maybe some of that external pressure of, like you said, that this is the way it's supposed to go?
Like what sources of external pressure I maybe felt?
Yeah, like where was that? Do you know, like, where was that coming from, or like what was helping kind of create that narrative for you?
Yeah, I think there was a little external pressure that maybe turned into internal pressure of like people around me starting to have children, like friends of mine, some family members, where it kind of felt like, okay, if I want a child of ours to be raised alongside some of these people,
Oh,
like,
gotcha.
to kind of have similar ages, like this would be potentially the time. Um, But I also think like I'm from the Midwest, and I do think, I'm sure it's different depending on where you grow up in the United States, but in the Midwest, it's pretty typical that like you do follow this natural progression. Like you right, go to school, you get a job, you get married, you find a house, you have a kid. Like those are your steps like in sequence.
Mm,
And I really don't know honestly anyone from here that like has not really followed that trajectory like within my circle, which obviously could be like some
wow.
skewed data. but
Yeah,
but
fair.
like I can't really say which came first, but it is kind of, to me it seems like this assumption that you're just going to. And once we got married, I mean, people ask you about it all the time, like when are you gonna have kids, when are you gonna have kids? No one ever really asks you like, do you guys want to have kids? Like, are you planning on having kids? And even
Mm,
that, like, I don't know if people have to ask regardless, but the fact that they ask in general kind of shows like there's this assumption that you're going to. It's just like when or what's going to happen with it
yeah.
versus assumption that, like, okay, well, you get married and maybe you'll live child free, maybe you won't live child free. Like, right, maybe you'll adopt, maybe you'll do something else. Like there's really not inherent discussion about that. So I
Mm,
feel like that's kind of that gave some pressure where it's like, right, there's an assumption that it's happening. There is no conversation about like, have you thought about whether or not you want kids? Like, what are you thinking about with that? How are you making that decision? Like, it doesn't get talked about, I guess, as if it's an active decision. It gets talked about like that's just happening. It's
mm.
the next
That's in your
thing.
future. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, which I think, which like I mentioned before, the interesting thing is like when I started talking to a lot of my friends about like struggling with this decision and not being sure, a lot of them were like, "Yeah, I've had similar doubts. I've thought similar things." And like nobody ever, right, nobody mentions it because it's like not in the line of communication.
Yeah. Do you think, had it been reframed that way, like you said, of, hey, what have your guys' thoughts been on kind of family planning? Is that something that you guys are discussing? Is that kind of, oh, that's not where we're going? Would that have, one, been received well, do you think, by you? And then two, would that, do you think, have changed kind of that feeling of external pressure? Because I think, hopefully other folks that are maybe have potential parents or people that are kind of in that same time frame as you were in their lives, and I think that's such helpful um, information for them of how can we support from a way that doesn't necessarily put that external pressure, because I don't know that anybody necessarily goes into it going, I'm asking these questions to be intrusive or to be pressuring. However, like you said, many times that is kind of just where our mind goes and it comes out that way. And it does kind of put this kind of construct on what your life maybe ought to look like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would have received it well because I think it opens up the conversation. Well, it opens it up where it's normal for you to think about it, right? Like
Okay.
the whole theme of what we're talking about, like normalizing things. If someone
Mm-hmm.
had asked us or asked me, like, "Oh, what are you thinking for, your future family? Are you thinking of having children? Are you thinking of living like child free? Is that something like you've given thought to?" Then I think it would have the next line or opening is like, "Oh yeah, like we have been talking about it. I'm not sure. I'm trying to make the decision." It would have led to probably more honest conversation versus
Mm.
when the question is like, "Oh, when are you guys having kids? Like, are you trying yet?" Again, these to your point, I think it's all out of and honestly, it's out of excitement. Like people are excited and hoping you have, another family member that they get to love on, and like it comes from such a good, kind-hearted place. But
Yeah.
it leaves this assumption that you've already decided you're going to have them. It's a matter of when. And so the
Mm.
conversation just starts off, I think, from a more closed spot. Because then you feel like, oh, well, if I say I'm doubting it, does that mean something's wrong with me? Does that mean like, are people going to assume that like maybe I'm not really going to be a great mom because I didn't go into it like totally knowing, I wasn't someone who was like 100% positive. So is that going to be seen as good or bad? You
Like
know,
if you decide to move forward, that could be kind of the judgment later.
yeah, or like where it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, well, like it's all, and again, that might be more internal, but like because the assumption is that you're going to do it, if internally you were unsure, what does that say about you? Like what does that mean?
Yeah.
Um, and then right, does that mean like you are not going to be as good of a parent, or does that mean that, there's like something wrong that you didn't know ahead of time that was like exactly what you wanted? Um,
Mm.
So yeah, so I think I would have received that well. And I think if people talked about it more in that way, I think people could come to those decisions possibly faster. Because I think it took me a while to decide because I was kind of on my own, with some of my husband's support, but a little bit on my own thinking about like what I wanted to do without really
Yeah.
knowing other people were even struggling with that or that other people would have had doubts too, and that it's okay to have doubts. That doesn't mean anything more.
Did you have any kind of narrative for yourself that your brain was trying to kind of convince you of, if you will, if you had come to the decision of, I don't know if I do, maybe my answer is no. Was there something that was kind of keeping you from going there, or that, your brain was kind of telling you, if I did say no, this is what it would say or mean about me?
Um, I think personally, felt I wouldn't have felt like anything was wrong with that decision for myself.
Okay.
I think the narrative more so would have been like, what are maybe other people going to think about it? Like, is there going to be external judgment for it? Are people going to understand that
Mm.
decision? Um, yeah, I feel like the more of the narrative is like, are people going to look at this as if this was like not the right decision? I feel like sometimes too I haven't heard this myself, but I've just heard it anecdotally through other people that like some people say, "Oh, well like what if you regret it if you like didn't, if you don't have them and then you wait too long?" And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, so then again, like the feedback could be that I'm like making a mistake with like an
Hmm.
intentional decision.
Mm-hmm.
Um and like unfortunately, like you would never know, if you'd regret it or not, but like that feedback from people, I guess, just doesn't lend itself to you feeling like confident in your choice. So that's more so what I would have been concerned of, that there would have been a narrative that I was like making a mistake from external parties.
Yeah. And it almost sounds like, kind of again going back to this idea of, is it a choice for you, or it's already kind of written for you and you really have no say. And I can imagine if it feels that way, that's, I mean, I don't know anybody who likes to feel kind of powerless in decisions, especially when it comes to their own life and something that's so permanent,
Hmm.
like a parent, becoming a parent.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why it also felt so important to me because I'm like, there is no like, yeah, like you know, you can't return them. Like, there's nothing you can do. Like, you have this is your life. Like, you're choosing this step. So it just felt so important to me because I'm like, there's no other choice that you can't change, like in your life
Mm,
that you make. Like, you can change your job, you could change your partner, like you could change where you live. Like, everything is really totally up to you. But once you have a child, that's your child and like that's your job and you've decided to take on this role. And I'm so happy I'm in that role now. I'm happy I came to that decision because it's
mm,
been so rewarding even with its challenges. But I don't think I would have felt the same if I had just gone into it without really being methodical about it. And a little some of that's my personality, but I also think again it gave me a lot of clarity beforehand to kind of weather like all the things that I couldn't control afterward.
mm. So maybe it sounds like maybe able to kind of get to some of that, quote unquote radical acceptance maybe a little bit easier because there was a lot more of you in that decision than
Yeah.
maybe everyone else, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I think it's good to clarify like I feel like we're in an age where you can really do a lot. Like you can have a lot of job flexibility, you can move wherever you want if you want to. Like I think people just have a lot more exposure to like different options, which I think is great. But
Mm,
also because of that, like you have all these options, or you could like do this traditional route, or you could do something in the middle. And I think it's just good for people to get clarity on like what they really want their life to look like because they do have all these options, which doesn't mean like again, like I kind of did choose that whole path of like get married and now have the kids. Like I did that, but I didn't do it just because that's kind of what was assumed. I did it because I really know that that's what I wanted. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, so I hope that that helps people. And again, I think it's something it seems like a lot more people are thinking about now, especially with timelines of having kids or like, right, you could also just have one kid. You don't have to have multiple kids, things like that's a whole different conversation. Um,
Right.
but so I think it's just helpful, hopefully, that people can see that there's a lot of ways to getting to a decision. There's not like this one beaver cleaver route.
Absolutely. And again, that normalizing it and that if the answer is no, how can we maybe have a little bit more of that compassion and that, acceptance that we all have to make these decisions, like you said, for ourselves. And it's really not fair to kind of put our own expectations on somebody else when we're asking them to make kind of these life altering decisions for their life.
Yeah, absolutely. And right, I mean I think there are more people now that are deciding to live child free, and there's just nothing wrong with that. Like if people want to focus their goals on other things, they also might like be in these other roles where they could work with children or be with children. It doesn't have to be having your own children. Like you could work in a school and be around children all the time and not
Mm-hmm.
want your own children, or maybe you want a child but you're not ready right now and biologically like time-wise that doesn't work. So you adopt at a later time. Like I think just even the time pressure is so much that it's
Yeah.
got to be within, by a certain time. So if that doesn't work for people, like there are alternatives too that don't mean like the door is always, it's either open or shut. There's a lot of
Mm,
gray area.
yeah. And that maybe it just does require some of that creativity, like you were mentioning, of what it looks like. And maybe it doesn't look like the Joneses, as you
Hmm.
mentioned. And that's totally okay. You get to kind of create your own life and your own family in whatever way that looks like.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool. Yeah. Um, Is there anything kind of here in this last minute that if you could kind of go back and tell yourself or tell any other folks that are maybe in that position? I know you've already offered quite a bit of nuggets, but anything else that you would kind of offer to someone or offer to yourself back then?
Yeah, I think I would have just approached it sooner. I think that like in my mind, like,
Mm,
oh, I have all this time and I'll just like figure it out later. But that kind of was like a clue that maybe I was avoiding it a little because I think like with most things in my life, if I have a decision to make, like I'll just make the decision. Like I don't think that it like I never make choices. So then
okay.
with this one, since it like I kind of kept putting it on the back burner, putting it on the back burner, I think that was a clue that I should like kind of turn toward it, not keep turning away from it.
Hmm.
Um, I would have gotten that book sooner, and then I would have talked to people. I would have talked to people about it sooner too, because I think I started
Yeah.
talking to people about it when I was really in the thick of like, what do I do? I'm unsure, but I could have talked about it, like even just asking people what they were thinking for themselves, and like I could have done that, way before. Um,
Hmm.
so probably just being more vulnerable about it before that I probably would have given myself that advice.
Wow, I love it. Well, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for sharing that with us. I know I've got all my pieces, and you've got kind of a bready, kind of toasty, crunchy bread that you've put on your list. How do I construct this? Because I've got all my pieces.
Yes.
So
So
how do
you
I
put
put it together?
so you put the polenta in your bowl first,
Okay,
and then you put the egg and the veggies on top, and then
perfect.
you put the pesto sauce on top of the whole thing, a little olive oil drizzle, and then
Awesome.
yeah, and then the toast is for you to just like dip and eat some of the polenta egg mix all together.
Wonderful. Well, I'm super excited to try this. Thank you so much for sharing this with me and your story. I think that such valuable information and, like you said, a conversation that needs to happen more often because it is a very big decision with life altering kind of consequences, and normalizing that it's okay to kind of have, like you said, some of those struggles and not be like, oh yes, this is exactly what I want in my life. All of those variants and those grays, like you mentioned, are okay, and it doesn't mean that it makes you any less of a person. I think that's hugely valuable. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for being willing to share that with us and being on our show today.
Yeah, you're so welcome. I'm so happy to have been a part of it. Thank you so much.
Yes. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today. We'll see you next time. If you or anyone that you know is struggling with any of the topics that we discussed in today's episode, make sure to check out our show notes for support and resources. You can get help. Thanks again for joining us on today's episode of The Real Family Eats. If you're a parent ready to share your real life parenting story, make sure to reach out to us in our website found in the show notes. And that goes for today's recipe, social medias, support, and resources. All of that can be found in our show notes. So make sure to check them out. And make sure to follow, like, share, subscribe, and stay up to date on all things The Real Family Eats. I hope you'll join us next time for more food for thought and thoughtful food. Enjoy your eats.